Hey guys, this is Chris Monk, owner of Highline Guitars, and you're watching another episode of in truth, I don't have a particular finish that I would call my favorite. I have several different approaches to finishes that I like to do. It just depends on what it is I'm trying to accomplish. If I'm going for a high gloss mirror finish, I have one method. If I'm going for a hand rubbed satin natural oil finish, I have a different approach. And in this next couple of episodes, what I'd like to do is show you how I do a satin hand rubbed oil finish on my guitars. I really enjoy doing this finish because it's very easy to do, and all the products and materials that you need to do it are available at your local hardware store or arts and crafts store. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about how to prep the wood and get it ready. And then in future episodes, I'll be talking about how to fill the grain, how to tint the wood, and how to apply a durable clear coat finish once it's all done. So let's get started. When it comes to getting a great finish on a guitar, it all comes down to how well you prep the wood in the beginning. What we have to do is we have to remove all the tool marks that were left by bandsaws, routers, rasp files, chisels, whatever tools that you needed to use to get to this point. We need to remove the marks that were left. So we typically will do that with a coarse sandpaper. In this case, I'm using a P120 grit. I don't like to go any coarser than 120 because when you get down to 180 grit and that, the double digit grits, the scratches that those sandpapers leave can be really tough to remove. So I try to go with as fine a grit as I can. So I'm using a P120. Now the P means it's a European grading system of sandpaper. And if there's no P there, then it's the American grade. I can't remember exactly what they call it, but the European grade of sandpaper with the P is a much more consistent sanding grit. So when you sand with it, you get a more consistent scratch pattern, and that results in a much better finish. So I use the P. This is Mirka sandpaper. I highly recommend you use the best quality sandpaper you can find. And the brands that I always look at are Mirka, Norton, 3M, Klingspor, and they tend to do the best job. So, stick with a good quality sandpaper. Don't go and try and cut corners and go with a cheap brand, because the end result is usually not going to be up to what you want as far as a finish quality. And I also use sanding blocks to wrap the sandpaper around. I never sand with my fingers, because when you sand with your fingers, you're applying uneven pressure, and that leaves little grooves in the surface, and you can actually feel it. And then if you're going for a gloss finish later on, you can see that in the reflections. They're all wavy and look bad. So on flat surfaces, I always use a hard block of wood. On curved surfaces, I like to use foam rubber, and I have a couple of different blocks that are different stiffnesses. This is it's a giant eraser that I found at my local dollar store, and this thing is awesome for sanding around curved surfaces because it really conforms to the shape, and I can wrap the sandpaper around it and sand really very consistently. So that's what I like to use on the rounded edges. Now when you sand, you always, of course, and you've probably heard it before, you want to sand in the direction of the grain. That's not always possible, because on edges here we're not able to always follow the grain in cutouts and that sort of thing. That's okay. You just want to make sure that you're sanding in the same direction, because when you move from the coarse grits up to the fine grits, as long as you're sanding in the same direction, the sanding scratches will become less visible and are easier to deal with. So the other big question that people have is, when do you know when to move up in grits? In other words, once you've finished with 120, when do you move when you know you're finished so that you can move on to 150. And the way I do it, it takes a little bit of practice and experience, but I use a light and I hold on a lamp and I hold it at a low angle, and then I just look at the guitar with my eyes at a low angle. So low angle light, eyes at a low angle, and you can really see the condition of the surface. And what you're going for is a consistent scratch pattern. So if you're sanding with 120 grit, you want the entire surface to look exactly the same kind of scratches. If after you've sanded with 120, you still see maybe a tool mark or two, you need to work on those areas and get rid of them before you move on. And it's also important to remember that when you're sanding a surface like this with the grain, the middle area that you're sanding is getting the most work. The ends, where you stop and reverse direction, is getting about half as much sanding action. So for that reason, a lot of times you'll notice that the scratches are worse at the edges and wherever it is you stopped. So you have to be aware of that and then go back in and focus on sanding just those areas to get rid of those scratches. And then once you've noticed that the entire surface, and I'm not talking just about the top, I'm also talking about, the sides, the back. Once you've got everything sanded to a consistent scratch pattern, and the scratches are all going in the same direction, then you can move on to the next grit. So if you started with 120, you would go to 150, and then you would do the same thing. Now, when you've finished with the 120 and you notice you've got that nice consistent scratch pattern, try to memorize how that looks. And the reason you want to do that is because once you've sanded with 150, you'll notice that the scratch pattern is a little bit finer than it was at 120. And what you want to do is you want to be able to look at that wood across that surface, and you want to make sure that there are no scratches that appear to stand out. So you'll know you're done with 150 when there are not a single 120 grit scratch left in the surface. Then you can move on to 220, and once you're done with the 220, you'll be doing the same thing. You're replacing the 150 grit scratches with 220 grit scratches. Now you probably think, well, I don't want any scratches at all. Remember, when you're looking straight down, you cannot see the scratches. You can only see them when you're looking at an angle. And by the time you get to 220, the scratches are so fine, it's very, very hard to see it. Some people have argued and said, well, you should go to 400 or 600 or whatever. In my experience, it makes no difference. And so why would you want to spend the extra hour sanding from 220 to 320 to 400 or even further? And when the results are going to really not be any different than if you just stopped at 220. So I like to stop at 220. And at that stage, I'm ready to move on to the next step, which is going to be filling the grain. And I'm going to save that for the next episode. And I'm going to show you a technique that I use that doesn't require that you go out and buy any special kind of grain fillers. The materials are available at your local hardware store. It's very easy to do and it's very quick and very effective. So until then, I've got a lot of sanding to do.